This podcast has regularly featured scholarship that disrupts existing understandings of the West, especially oversimplified ones that have become so familiar that we stop thinking critically about them. This template was set early with Victoria Lamont and our episode 2 conversation about the earliest stages of Western novels and literature and how influential female authors have been overlooked. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rinsink. And this month we turn to another overlooked presence in the West by speaking with Sara Gallagher about her new book, Black Wests: Reshaping Race and Place in Popular Culture. Gallagher, a former student of Lamont and whose work echoes Lamont's approach, directs our attention to Black writers, filmmakers, and others whose productions and personal experiences asserted Black presences in Western geographies and narratives from which they have been largely excluded, ignored, or forgotten. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rinsink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Sara Gallagher is Professor of Liberal Studies at Durham College in Ontario, Canada. She there teaches courses on literature, composition, and technical writing. She holds a bachelor's and master's in English literature and public text from Trent University and a PhD in English literature from the University of Waterloo. Her research and publishing has intersected literary and cultural studies in the American West with Black histories in the region and literary, film, and other media productions set there. Her recent book, Black Wests: Reshaping Race and Place in Popular Culture, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2025. In Black Wests, Gallagher asks us first to consider the white perspectives that have traditionally dominated familiar American West histories and narratives, as well as in the quote-unquote Westerns, the set of genres of literature, film, and other media set in the West, and then introduces the voices of often overlooked Black American writers and filmmakers to explore how their work centered the lives of Black individuals and relationships to the West. Their productions both asserted Black experiences and belonging as Western and crafted Western stories that were fundamentally Black. In both directions, Gallagher reveals how Black stories, often framed in migration to the frontiers of white society, re-envisioned Western frontiers as spaces for Black reinvention, spaces for challenging imposed identities and roles, and for making demands for social, economic, and cultural participation in quote-unquote American stories, but on their own terms. As many episodes have previously, this conversation will likely introduce listeners not only to new historical figures, events, or stories, but also new ways of thinking about the West as a region, about its inhabitants, and how it has served as a powerful cultural landscape on which different peoples have told their stories, forged identities, and wrestled with their belonging. As other conversations have, this one left me again motivated to more intentionally search out new voices and perspectives, of which I am certain there are enough left to be uncovered by generations of academic scholars and the general public alike. Professor Sara Gallagher, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to hear, we were just chatting that you're surviving the current polar vortex, and staying warm.
We are staying warm. It's cozy here, at least inside, but the weather has been interesting to say the least.
Let's just dive right in. I usually start these conversations by asking authors about their personal connection with the North American West as kind of an entry point for us to understand literally where you're coming from, but also your scholarly path in a way.
I mean, for me, the interest and the connection to the American West, the North American West, there is a personal connection, but it is far back in my family history. My family came over to the Americas basically and then went back to Ireland, but they've settled in parts of the West. So that's a very long story, which I won't get into in this podcast. But there, I didn't know about that history until I studied the American West. And I came to it in scholarship in my very lightly, very superficially in my MA because I was focused on American authors and specifically the Beat Generation, which the Beat Generation, everybody thinks San Francisco, California, that kind of Pacific in sort of community, or perhaps urban spaces like New York. But there were quite a lot of, let's say, they were citing Western authors, and some of them were citing even people like Chester Himes, whom I write about in this book. And then, in my PhD, I got interested in the American West in part because I wanted to work with my supervisor, Victoria Lamont. And that's what sort of led down, or that's a very concise history of how I became interested in this topic. Because once you kind of become interested in the topic, it's sort of like a deep dive. You just fall into it. There's so much history and so many stories to listen to and learn about. And so really just a concise history there, about how I came to the American West.
It's interesting that you were working on beat authors, in San Francisco, but weren't thinking that of them or that place that as explicitly Western,
Mhm.
which which I think is intriguing because often, yeah, the Pacific Coast, we don't imagine it with kind of the same Western, quote unquote, Western tropes, that we do with other Western spaces. But now that you've become a scholar of the West and you look back on that work, do you see now ways in which like, oh, I should have been thinking along Western lines, or I should have not assumed that the West meant something that this beat location was not a part of?
That's a really good question because that is a question that I did think of when I was, writing this book and preparing for this book because in my mind, as in most people's mind, when they think of the American West, they're going to have images of Westerns. They're gonna have images of cowboys. They're gonna have images of cactuses, people riding the range, and perhaps other kinds of images, rodeos, that kind of thing. But in reality, I think when we think of the West, we can't just think of one particular cultural idea, right? It's multifaceted. It is so kind of diverse in its sort of history and even its perception of geography. So when we're thinking like the Beat Generation, they were located in mainly urban spaces or traveling along the road. We're thinking of like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is the quintessential go out west story in the vehicle, in the automobile. And we see that sort of narrative in stories before him. Of course, I'm thinking of like John Steinbeck's uh, Grapes of Wrath, right? Going out west once again. And that kind of narrative of traveling to California, it's usually California, but not always, is very much part of the Western kind of the larger Western story, right? Because we think back to settlers who were going out west to get land, and wherever they settled, it wasn't necessarily the Pacific West, but it was still that kind of journey. And I would still say, based on the research I did, uh, that's a very monolithic idea of the West that has was complicated so much by my research into the Black West. It was complicated so much because that's only one piece of the much bigger story.
Yeah, like, I always joke with friends or, "Oh, tell us about this or that," or they ask some historical question. I'm like, "Well, it's complicated,"
Yeah, yeah.
and which is rarely what they want. That's not what they want to hear. They don't wanna hear all of our nuance and complication, but that's what makes it interesting to us, and if we can get them on board, I think it eventually makes it interesting to others as
Mhm.
well, right? So what led you to decide to focus then on Black literature, film, history, Black experiences, in the West?
Really because at first there were so many gaps that I saw. I didn't see the stories being told by scholarship. I did see, of course, I will admit, there is quite a plethora of scholarship about certain Black Western figures. We think of like Nat Love, or we think of Oscar Michaud. If you know those names, if you don't, that just sort of proves the point that even though there is that scholarship there, a lot of people don't associate those names or they don't know those names and their connections to the American West. And when I was researching, this is actually kind of speaking more to a common issue that a lot of researchers in the Black West face. There is a lot of stories and narratives that are still in the archives and still sort of on the top shelf. They're not really being researched just yet, or it takes time to find them. And one of them was Jenny Carter. Thankfully, scholar Eric Gardner, he did a wonderful book on Jenny Carter's works and her letters to the San Francisco Elevator, which was a periodical
Hmm.
in the 1800s, a Black periodical. And that helped me say, find the research I needed, but also go a little bit further and find other stories as well. But a lot of it's sort of just still stuck in archives. So as a just scholars know this, when you see that gap and when you realize, oh, this is more than just, my own gain, right? My own scholarly gain from this. I actually do wanna see these stories in print. I wanna see people read about them. I wanna see people complicate their ideas of what the American West was, and that's really the aim of the book.
Yeah, that's one of the core things I think a lot of us end up landing on in terms of what's the one of the primary values of whatever it is we've done. It's the recovering of I don't wanna say lost or forgotten stories because there probably are families and communities who
Mhm.
have never forgotten these people or stories, but in the broader, scholarly or public consciousness, recovering those and making them available so people can think about them and then take research and, even further, right? Your source material, though, is a lot different than a lot of what I am most familiar with. You're working with, literature, film, other kinds of, like, cultural, productions and media. My work has been more quote unquote traditional archival textual records like letters and
Mm.
journals and government reports. I did do a lot of work with newspapers, so we do have some overlap there. But I'm curious, by using those kinds of sources, what are the different or unique questions that you think you're able to ask or sit with and chew on as opposed to the kind of records that I would go to if I wanted to like try to tell a history of some of these exact same figures? But not doing, like, literary analysis of, their novels and things. What's unique about what you're able to do with these sources that someone with my methodology might simply miss?
Well, I think, yeah, you pinpointed that the approach I've taken is a multimedia approach. So I do mention films, I mention literature or literary works. I think there's a little bit of poetry in there too. I think there's a video game somewhere mentioned. It's been a while since I wrote the book. But I do remember that I was worried about that when I when I started researching because I was thinking I'm going to go to the archives only, right? This is where I'm going to start, and this is where I'm going to finish. But there was also the question for me because it was a question that was bothering me. The image of the popular West, and that kind of is mentioned in my title, the popular West. The image of the popular West um, is is one of those, or popular culture is one of those things that sort of saturates American culture, even in the smallest ways. And this might even be kind of speaking to how I'm Canadian, so how we perceive America in the popular realm. And so when I'm looking at stories that had, I suppose, larger audiences than, say, some of the narratives and letters we might find in archives, I wanted to see how it was disrupting that image. So that was the approach I was taking. So where was, for instance, Nat Love's autobiography, it is considered, I mean, if you go type in American Black West into Google, he probably will pop up. But doing a literary analysis of that reveals a lot of ways that even though there were Black writers and Black filmmakers making, writing and making these kinds of stories, these Westerns, they were still being left out. There was still a kind of a subtle erasure going on. And so I wanted to see how Black creators were interacting with a larger mythology, which sometimes, for sure, the archive, yeah, I do some archival work here in the book. When the archive is sort of, you do your research and you produce a kind of a text on, say, a lesser known author or a lesser known figure, by all means, that can still disrupt, right, our image of a particular geography, region, or history. But for me, I wanted to see how those authors and creators were interrupting the popular image we have of the West. And so that's why I did resort to a lot of literary analysis. And there is some cultural analysis in there too. There's some film analysis as well, you know? It sort of helped me sort of deconstruct that image we have.
And kind of in real time, because these are products that they were putting out to the
Yeah.
public, whether or not they're being consumed, but by focusing on the I don't like the word product, I don't know what we should call it, but the thing that they created as the source, whether I mean, its reception history is important, but whether or not it how it was received, what they were intending to do with
Mm.
it, are things you could do with that document that in their archival records, maybe you wouldn't find all kinds of biographical information about them and who they are and what they did.
Mhm.
But so I think that's really interesting. And it's a kind of scholarship that I do not have much experience in. So when I see people doing it, I'm always impressed with the things that scholars like you are able to pull out of a novel. That's not just conjecture but like really well reasoned reading between the lines and pulling truth out that I don't know if I could have extracted.
Well, it's really interesting, and I can use maybe a particular case study for this, response, because I did study, the works of Pauline Hopkins, and she was a Black American author, journalist, editor of the Colored American magazine. She had quite a title in her community, but she was located in the Northeast, so she had, once again, a very interesting perspective of the American West. And when you do a literary analysis of her book, Winona, which I would consider one of the first Black Westerns, it really was one of the first fictional Black Westerns. Um, it takes on, once again, it takes on tropes that we see in typical American Westerns. So images of the indigenous communities being displaced. It takes on certain problematic tropes as well of indigenous communities, but it also inserts the slave narrative into the story, which is, I find, quite an intervention, right? Because oftentimes Westerns don't have mention of that, except I think people can imagine Django Unchained, right? Quentin Tarantino's
Mm.
film, which is a whole that's a whole other response because I have a few criticisms of that film. But that's what they think of, when in reality, the image of the kind of the narrative of the American West, as it was perceived and written about by people like Pauline Hopkins, was already intervening in the typical story that we hear by including slavery, right? By including the history that biracial people had to go through. In this case, there's biracial protagonists, and the colorism that they faced, as well as the difficulties and oppression that they faced in all different communities that they met in the American West.
I think we're gonna circle back to Hopkins and Winona in a bit. Yes, and I don't wanna get ahead of myself, though. What I wanted to do for the remainder of our time is in your introduction, you lay out 4 what you call central questions,
Mhm.
things that you were trying to address, and I'm not gonna do them in order, but I thought they might provide an interesting framework because 'cause I'd like you to maybe unpack each of those questions, and then maybe we can highlight a few examples from some different chapters that, help you that illustrate how you were answering them. The first is, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing rather than directly quoting but, the first is you wanted to figure out how conceptions of race or blackness changed as these historical Black voices have been recovered by scholars like you. And I think we flirted with this idea
Mhm,
already a little
mm.
bit, but can you explain kind of what spurred this question? Because I'm curious, is this something that you came to the project already wanting to explore, or if this was something that emerged along the way?
It emerged along the way because in my research, this goes back to my PhD, so that's a ways back now. Um, in my research, I of course, conceptions of race, and I do connect the ideas of race and place, right? Because I think that conceptions of race change depending on the community and the geography someone is in. That can be a contested statement. Some people have said, "You know what? That doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. You're going to have to explain that again and again." And what I found, and as researchers can kind of sympathize with this, is that as I was reading stories that I was going to research greater in greater detail, Oscar Micheaux, Nat Love, Pauline Hopkins, their portrayal of race and their experiences of being a racialized person changed depending on the geographies that they were in, right? So it was not.
Or the geographies they were portraying in the work?
Yeah, portraying in the
So
work.
they
Yeah.
them themselves and their films or books or
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm getting the 2 confused because sometimes they were
Mhm.
there was
Yeah,
autobiographical
yeah, yeah.
elements in there. But yeah, so that's where I thought, well, conceptions of race are being portrayed very differently. And, as a person who's white, I'm a white person, I don't experience that. And so it was something that I found very interesting because it became very clear to me, especially with Oscar Micheaux, who was a himself at the beginning of his life a settler. He settled in South Dakota. He wanted to, live the American dream, so to speak, of building his quote unquote empire in South Dakota. He failed terribly and then became a writer and filmmaker, very successful filmmaker. His experiences there were incredibly humbling because he was facing a racism that was not really discussed and not really developed. We don't even still have discussions of how Black settlers were, or at least more, we should have more thorough discussions about it, how Black settlers were often excluded from being part of larger communities in these or larger settler communities in these regions, and the isolation that turned into the core struggle of his characters in his books, right? That isolation, having to accept the fact he won't ever be able to build that empire. And so race and place are constantly interacting, and that's what I meant by that question is how the conception of race is just it's so changeable, and for me, it was a real a point where it allowed me to sort of investigate those texts um, in a more thorough way.
So what's interesting here is that what you're saying and what some of what you've discovered is that it would be inappropriate for us to take kind of the ideas of institutionalized racism, say in 1880, that we're familiar with farther east or in the South, and assume that we can just directly apply that framework to Black homesteaders out on the plains or Michaud in South Dakota and assume that he faced the same kinds of racism or discrimination and so forth, and that the outcomes would or his experience would have been the same.
Mhm.
Uh, not the case. it's different and unique because of the location.
I do believe that, and then that's what my research kind of revealed. It's something that once again, and this is maybe a weakness of even literary scholarship, right? We tend to put things into big monolithic categories: the slave narrative, the Western, the the Mid-Atlantic narrative, that kind of thing. And in reality, especially during a time when migrations were so common, when people were moving back and forth and kind of experiencing different regions and different places, there was at least in in those places, there was a lot of different a lot of different experiences that they had. But to kind of roll back to what I was saying about how geographies play into um, a person's experience of being racialized. Yeah, I don't think that someone in, say, for instance, coming from the South, a lot of the Black settlers who came from the South, part of the Great Migration, they were expecting the Midwest to be a very open space, very accepting, as we see in the story of Nicodemus, right? Which
Mhm.
was once again a pretty tragic one. Their farms basically they weren't able to keep their farms. Um, that they ended up facing a very interesting form of oppression and segregation that was not quieter, but it seemed quieter. It was just not a very good uh, a very good experience. I don't know if I
Mhm.
answered that question very well.
No, 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 no,
Tried.
yeah, what's also interesting in as you explore some of these authors and filmmakers and others is that they seem to be actively and what I'm curious here is whether you think they are as consciously doing this as we now see that maybe in effect they were doing, how they were reworking, subverting, or reimagining the West, frontier mythologies and tropes and narratives by the fact that they were asserting their presence there, their belonging, or their attempts at belonging, be it actually them or the characters that they're writing or portraying in film. So by telling Black stories in the West, contextualizing Black experiences as Western experiences, in real time, they are pushing for changing conceptions of race and Blackness.
I would say they all did that. The case studies I focused on, they all did that, but they did it in very different ways. That's kind of part of the answer to the original question I had. Um, for instance, with Oscar Micheaux, he wanted to use the Western narrative of settling land, building his empire as a way to assimilate initially, and of course that failed, as I said. Nat Love is a very curious story because he also, um, became a cowboy. He was after he, was freed from being enslaved, he became a cowboy, and then mention of his race disappears in his autobiography until the end of the book when he becomes a Pullman porter, which I mean, as a scholar, I kind of approach that with questions of why does he not mention his race for, about 150 pages, you know? Where did that go? Because obviously that wouldn't have disappeared in his experiences, but this is kind of how what I meant by perceptions or conceptions of race and how it's portrayed. Sometimes Black Americans had to assimilate, right? At least in how they portrayed themselves in the West. Other times, they were resisting that, like in Pauline Hopkins, where she's portraying characters in Winona that are actively resisting being stereotyped, right, to a certain idea of what the typical cowboy or typical Westerner should look like. And same thing with, Chester Himes. I would say Chester Himes, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, is definitely not a traditional Western, but it is a Western story. He goes out west. At the beginning of the novel, his character Bob Jones, and this was there was autobiographical elements in the novel, right? He goes out to California hoping to find acceptance, a good job, maybe, I don't know, a film career at some point. He ends up as a dock worker and finds himself in a very bad place, being accused of a terrible crime. So it's, this experience of the West is often seen as negative, but I find it actually very interesting because a lot of the Black authors and creators were clearly disrupting this idea that we have of the mythological West, where you can go out, get your land if you're a settler, or become successful or gain fame. That was not the case. It was much more complicated. And yet, still, a lot of these authors and creators were using that narrative as a way to speak out against the racism that they experienced or the oppression that they experienced.
They're co-opting some of those tropes and narratives as a way
Mhm.
to say something that those tropes and narratives were never intended to
Yeah.
say, to the broader society. You also touched on, I mean, to segue to another one of your central questions, which you already touched on, and I'd like to kind of return to, with especially with Nat Love, is, you say that another question you're trying to explore is how many of these individuals were experiencing what you call double consciousness
Mm.
or dual identities, which you've already hinted at with some who are assimilating at points, being biracial, perhaps passing, other times asserting their blackness. Explain what you mean kind of a little bit more fully with double consciousness or dual identities. And for me, I think Nat Love was maybe the most unexpected and interesting example of
Mhm.
this.
So double consciousness is a term that was first used and defined by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it means being aware of one's own race, being aware of how you're seen by, in this case, if you're a Black person, you're seen by white people, or also aware of how you feel and how you see yourself, right? It's that dual sort of, uh, that duality that exists.
Because those two things may not
They
reconcile. They may be in constant tension, how you're perceived versus how you perceive
Yeah,
yourself.
they're in constant tension, right? And of course, double consciousness plays out all the time. If you use it as a framework to look at Black Westerns, you're seeing this constant tension between wanting to be part of that mythological space while also being racialized and excluded from that mythological space, right? So it creates this really weird tension. And that tension is noted a lot in all of the narratives, but I haven't mentioned her yet, and I should. Arabelle Thompson's American Daughter, which I think is a really ironic title, right? Because she experiences racism as when she settles in North Dakota as a child. She also finds herself assimilating, like, this is the contradictory experience. She finds herself assimilating into that environment, but also being accepted in that environment eventually. It takes time. And she sort of takes on that identity of, from North Dakota, I am a Midwesterner, that's who I am, right? That's my identity more so than or just as much as anything else. And that double consciousness, this is why I wrote about the book, Africa, Land of My Fathers, which was her travel narrative when she was a journalist and she went to Africa, traveled all throughout the continent. And during that time, she experienced I don't even know if there's a word for it, but it's almost like a triple consciousness where she expected to go home to, the land of her fathers. Of course, Africa is a continent. It's made of many nations. She didn't exactly know where to go, so she explored the continent and found herself in the middle of all these other tensions that existed. So, the sort of anti-colonial movements that were happening in South Africa at the time, apartheid, and at the time, there was also, slavery in parts of, the east parts of, Africa, and so she found herself in a very peculiar place where she was seen as American before she was seen as Black when she was in these spaces. So she experienced, not a homecoming, a kind of a further estrangement, right? And that made her reflect on her experiences in the United States. So this is something that it was a theme that I saw pop up again and again. And you mentioned that love, by all means, it's within those textual silences in the middle of his book when he's out He's a cowboy and he's doing all sorts of cowboy things, right? Kind of getting involved in gunfights and all that, where his race or verbal mention of his race disappears altogether. But he also includes photographs of himself as a cowboy, so he's clearly racialized in those images.
I wish we had some notes from the publisher or that explain the decision to include
The photos. Yeah.
photographs or illustrations of him visually displaying his blackness while the text itself is silent on it. I'm curious how conscious they were of that. It's a little strange. It's not what I
It's
expected.
very noticeable, and that's even if you're reading it very passively, the book, because the first part of the book, he is enslaved, and he is treated as a slave, so mention of his race is consistent. The experience of being racialized in such a violent space is consistent, and then, sh it moves to the Western narrative in one chapter, and suddenly there's no mention at all of him being black, right? There's only indication so slight when he meets a indigenous tribe. He says something along the lines, "Well, they can understand what it feels like to be me," and I'm assuming he's meaning his racialized state, right? But there's no mention there until the end of the book when he becomes a Pullman porter, which is historically, it's been a racialized occupation, right? So, that was a very interesting, uh, gap, right? It was very interesting what we
Yeah.
call textual silences and why are they there?
It's almost Turnerian in a
Mm.
way, if Turner argued that the experience of going out in the frontier is what turned Easterners or Europeans into Americans, right? They assumed a new identity by conquering the frontier. It's almost as if Nat Love's autobiography, like, his starting point, his original identity is very much rooted in being an enslaved black man, but then by participating in the frontier, that is erased away, and he participates and he becomes American in a way, well, until the end, where and in a way, he leaves the frontier, it's interesting, and I mean, I highly doubt that that's anything he intended, but there is this interesting idea that the frontier experience somehow assimilates or makes you American or allows you to assume new identities. But as you said, with all these other people, they're having to grapple with not even dual, sometimes maybe
Triple.
even more than two identities all at the same time, none of which really reconcile with each other or reconcile necessarily with how they view
Mm,
themselves.
absolutely, yeah, you sort of to speak on that too, in and I'm mentioning the case studies because the way to explain this is to give an example, right? A concrete example. In Oscar Michaud's works and his films, with the exception of the film, The Western Symbol of the Unconquered, which is by all takes a rather, um, radical film at the time because it was portraying the KKK as the typical bad guy, the enemy, and this was in the 1920s. So, of course, that might be seen as more normalized today, but back then, the KKK had quite an influence on the culture, and by doing so, he faced a lot of violence and error from the KKK, right? But aside from that film, he did other films, other westerns, where he portrayed, uh, going out west as, a solution to escaping the depravity of Eastern spaces. That is a very typical Turnerian sort of narrative where you're sort of leaving this and often it's portrayed in other binary ways. It's a more feminine space. The Eastern space as it goes out west, you enter into this sort of rugged masculine space. And he portrayed that sort of double consciousness geographically, right? Leaving this Eastern space for the West in order to, achieve his goals, and assimilate into the culture to become successful, to finally uplift himself. I use the term racial uplift because Oscar Michaud was very much Um, very much an admirer of Booker T. Washington and the racial uplift movement. Unfortunately, I think the more I read about Oscar Micheaux, the more I saw a tension within him that was never really reconciled, except for the film Symbol of the Unconquered, where I thought as a director, he's sort of facing his own, I guess you could say, his own issues, by just sort of portraying the, Black Western hero as conquering the r the white supremacist, racist, uh, uh, group or the community that was around him. So that was yeah, those are all part of the kind of tensions we see.
Well, I love that already. This is now the second time that we've actually started answering the next question that I wanted to ask, or the next of your central questions. And it's because in your book, you don't take these questions individually, they're addressed throughout. So this was maybe to be expected. But the next thing I want to talk about was you have this question about how do these Black American authors, filmmakers, or the texts or films about Black characters change? How do they co opt or change the quote unquote Western as a genre to reflect their experiences. And here you already explained with
Kind of.
Michaud using this Western landscape to but turning into a black protagonist defeating the white supremacists, which you swap out some of the characters and names, and it's a story that's in every Western, right? But with different races being, or maybe it's whites against like corrupt
Yeah.
Easterners, like a Western rugged individual protagonist against some corrupt businessmen or bankers or something, right?
Mhm.
Um, you also, and I wanted to get back to Winona, this novel by Pauline Hopkins a little bit, because interestingly how she kind of takes the Kansas frontier backdrop of and some familiar Western narratives that are told in places like that about savagery versus civilization. Um, and she uses that binary as a way to explore a more Black experience of freedom versus slavery. Can you unpack that a little bit for us as an example of how this author is taking the Western as a genre and reimagining it for her own purposes?
So I apologize in advance for giving a complicated answer, but it it it
No, I love
it
it.
really is a complicated approach because in some ways, uh, Pauline Hopkins, her portrayal of those of that, especially that binary that we do see in Western civilization versus savagery, is contradictory at one point, and but it does reveal some very interesting things about Black individuals at the time. Um, she turns the binary of civilization versus savagery on its she flips it, right? So instead of portraying into typical Westerns, the civilization is are white, right? The civilized are considered white settlers. The savage is considered the racialized other, right? She portrays the savage as the white supremacist slave system, right? And the civilized as those living, in her case, her characters are living as indigenous. They're living as part of an indigenous community as the actual civilized peoples. But and she shows how this is really how geography can impact perceptions of race, conceptions of race, and experiences of race. Some of her characters are, they're brought into slavery, they're captured and forced into slavery, and the fear of becoming seen or being seen as the savage is so overwhelming that they have to hold back and allow themselves to be abused, allow themselves to be tortured because they don't wanna be seen as the savage, right? And of course, there is a lot of historical weight to that, as we see in novels about slavery or histories about slavery. The idea of the black male savage is a very consistent trope. And specifically, some of her characters face that where they, rightfully want to seek justice for what they've experienced, which is brutal, right? They've experienced brutalization under the hands of slave owners, but they can't because the fear of becoming that stereotype is so overwhelming. So it's a complicated answer. She at once she tries to show the indigenous communities as being civilized, but also this double consciousness, this awareness of how the white slavery world sees them is very much still there. So they can never fully realize they can never fully participate, I should say, in these typical Western tropes that we see in Hollywood, where you can seek, justice for your experiences.
I've used examples with my students before in talking about how other countries have used the Western as a venue to tell their own stories, so co-opting our tropes and narratives, like in most famously, like some of the East German communist westerns where in very similar fashion, the capitalist cowboys are the bad guys and the indigenous peoples are the good guys, right? And it's a really fascinating with that inversion to have students kind of think about that and what that means. Um, I'm excited to now maybe include some of your examples because I was unaware of Winona or Oscar Devereaux's story, or some of these others where they seem to very intentionally take what their readers are going to expect from a western and use it to tell their story.
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting because I like I said, if you read the book, you'll get very different there's very many different answers to the questions you've asked, and that's why I sometimes struggle to answer them because I'm like, "Well, Winona or Pauline Hopkins does this, but Chester Himes does this." Or the films that I write about, I haven't mentioned him yet, but the Harlem Westerns of the '30s, which,
I did not know about these either, and this really blew my mind. Can you explain Harlem in the West? This was Herb. Is it
Herb
Herb
Jeffries, yeah,
Jeffries?
that's right.
Yeah,
So in those films, there are no white people and there are no indigenous people. They're completely blank. There's just black characters. They're called all black westerns. And of course, when they were made in the form of the singing cowboy kind of genre, right? The Gene Autry kind of genre, more or less for entertainment for black audiences to see themselves in these western spaces.
because like here's a really popular genre
Yeah.
that the broader society is really enjoying and everything. Well, we need a version of that for us.
That's exactly yeah, that's why they were made in some ways, at least Herb Jeffries, that's the story he told, that he made it to give young black boys a black cowboy to look up to. But they become, once again, really interesting from a scholarly point of view because there's one particular film in that, series called Two Gun Man from Harlem, and I'm thinking even the word "two," this sort of duality, uh, two. There is a duality in the film. He goes to the east, or the main character, the protagonist goes to the east, and it's a gritty kind of space, almost like a Western town in Harlem, where there's a lot of crime going on. There's a lot of like they go to a bar where they are faced with all sorts of interesting scenes, and he has to go to the east in order to become that rugged individual. So he kind of flips the narrative, or the typical storyline on its head. Then he can finally go back out west and bring out his more, let's say, aggressive side, right? Because he's dealing with
Mm.
criminals he can't deal with, otherwise. But that was an interesting kind of, uh, that's an interesting kind of play out of that typical theme.
The fourth, actually, and we've done these out of order from how you list them in your introduction, but you also say that you wanted these works to investigate how some of these revisions interacted with black
Mm.
stereotypes of blackness that already existed in westerns. There were often black characters in traditional
Yep.
westerns, but in very narrow stereotyped in very narrow ways. Can you explain to us what were some of those familiar black characters in existing westerns? And then I think we've already kind of explained what some of these authors and filmmakers do differently, but you also link this with the noir genre. Can you walk us through that a little bit? Like, what are the stereotypes that they're trying to subvert or supplement? And how is this all linked to some of the noir genre that was getting popular in the early 20th century?
So the first question about the more familiar westerns with black characters, I was familiar with, um, uh, Unforgiven, the film, Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, and that has a very curious portrayal of Black characters in it. Morgan Freeman's character is, um once again, he's kind of like Nat Love, he's not really racialized throughout the film. They don't really mention it. In reality, at the time, his race would have been very noticeable by a mostly white public, right, or white, community that he was interacting with. Um, but in terms of, Black characters in Westerns, and this kinda links a little bit to the second question about noir, we do see the noir genre, as it was portrayed in the '40s and '50s, the American noir, not really the French noir, but, we do see blackness is ever present in the noir genre, and I kind of explore that in the chapter on Chester Himes because, blackness becomes a motif in the noir, and that motif kind of, it basically builds into the idea that blackness is associated with uncertainty, with fear, with danger, and this is where I bring in Frantz Fanon, who talks about how that motif plays out in literature as well. But, in, at least in the noir that I wrote about, black noir itself, once again, inverts that typical motif to portray lightness or whiteness as the danger, as the uncertainty. So noir itself is I would say noir, just like the hard-boiled detective novel, is kind of an extension of the Western, or it shares a lot of similarities to it, just in a different environment or a different geography. It's like the urban Western in some ways, right? We see it as instead of the landscape, the plains or the desert landscape, it's replaced by the city and, usually a very urban city space, uh, and that is basically transposed into that space, or the Western is basically transposed into that space.
And instead of the cowboy or the, reluctantly violent vigilante, but who's out there for truth and justice, it's now this detective fighting against some corrupt
Yeah.
system or something in the streets of LA or whatever, yeah. But it's the same story, isn't it?
Basically the same story, yes.
I find this all really fascinating, and it makes me want to I haven't, I don't know what future class I can integrate all this in, but, it's given me all kinds of ideas of some new examples to use in teaching to complicate
Mm.
uh, familiar narratives, right? Especially like a course on like the Mythic West or something. I could see this uh, disrupting a lot of that, and a course like that or that topic itself is trying to disrupt other existing, narratives, and so it's disruptions upon disruptions, which I think is really delightful.
Yeah, I mean, I have developed a course I have not taught yet on it's just called Other Wests. And it really is exploring how because most of my students would be familiar with what most people are familiar with, the Western as a, cowboy and guns fights and that kind of thing, but the other West introduces the racialized West itself, or the West from a person of color's point of view. It also introduced Queer West as well, and so it's kind of interrupting. It's really just there to interrupt the typical Western narrative, but that's a course I'm developing. I just haven't, unfortunately, been able to teach it. It would be great to teach.
Well, do you want to take a moment as we wrap up to tell us what it is that you, and beyond developing this course, what is it that you're working on next in your scholarship, and what can we expect to see from you in the near or distant future?
So I'm currently working on an edited volume called Unsettling the Midwest. And it's about Black Americans in the Heartland, or it's Unsettling the Heartland. I'm getting the two confused here. Unsettling the Heartland, Black Americans in the Midwest. That's the tentative title. Um, and that is an edited collection of chapters from scholars. We have also chapters being written by descendants of settlers in different spaces in the Midwest, descendants of Black settlers. And artists, filmmakers, and they're kind of, once again, you can call me the unsettler or the disruptor here because it is meant to disrupt what we have, the idea we have of the Midwest itself. We talk about the very typical received idea of what the Midwest is, the heartland, right? And how these stories complicate that history, as well as how that these chapters complicate the even the literary narratives written about this space. So that's what I'm working on right now. It's a co-edited volume. I'm working with another scholar who has graciously sort of helped bring in some authors she knew, and it's going to be hopefully published by early 2027.
Who's the co-editor?
Jennifer Sudman. She is a
Okay.
co-editor.
Well, congrats on this book. That one seems like it's well underway. I think it's a real great contribution. And again, you're coming from the more literary studies, cultural studies world, but I always like to find ways in which, for me as a historian, for instance, to find ways to take your innovative methodologies that I don't have the skill set to do myself and to find ways to integrate them in what I do have the skill set to do in my own research and writing or in my teaching. And so I hope the historians and people from other disciplines as well will check this out because I think there's a lot of value here. Yeah.
There is a lot. I mean, I am primarily a literary scholar, right? But there is plenty for historians to approach when it comes to the Black West or the Black Midwest, because those methodologies that you use could, I think, be very helpful in sort of recovering a lot of the narratives that are missing or absent right now. And yeah, it would be. It's certainly there's a lot. There's a lot of research to be done, but it's exciting. It's all exciting.
Well, congrats again. Thanks for spending a few moments with us today. I really appreciate it.
Very welcome. I'm very. It's been a pleasure to chat about the book. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter.